Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first video lecture for Chapter 9, covering information privacy and confidentiality. In this video lecture, we're going to explore the foundations of privacy and confidentiality. We're going to review key aspects from the HIPAA privacy rule, which you'll be hearing a lot about throughout your career in HIM, and discuss your rights as individuals and professionals. We'll also get into the information blocking rule and its impact on release of information and health information. So let's have a look at this content. Okay, again, this is Chapter 9 covering information privacy and confidentiality. We use these terms interchangeably, but the reality is they're two related but different things. Privacy is the right to be left alone. We don't have a constitutional right to privacy. Confidentiality is a little bit different. This stems from sharing private, privileged information in confidence with somebody who has an obligation not to share it. So, privacy, again, the right to be left alone. We don't have a right to it. Confidentiality, the right to share information with only people that need to have the information. Use versus disclosure. Again, two terms that are often conflated together, but use is saying how an organization avails itself of information internally, how it uses information, if you will. Disclosure is how information is sent or disseminated outside. And again, state privacy laws that protect health information privacy will vary from state to state. For instance, California and Oregon are generally much more protective of patient privacy. When I was managing release of information in California, frequently I get calls from states, Texas, Louisiana, what have you. And if somebody was incarcerated in their state penal system, they'd be asking for HIV information and other things that we couldn't release to them without a certain process being followed. States also have laws that require the disclosure of health information, and this is usually related to communicable diseases, STIs, vital statistics, um, homicides, suicides, things like that. This information is disclosed from outside of a healthcare organization. The HIPAA privacy rule is within the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA of 1996. And there are five titles. Title II addresses medical liability reform, healthcare fraud and abuse prevention, and then something that is directly in the wheelhouse of health information management professionals, administrative simplification. And this covers privacy standards, security standards, transaction and code sets, identifiers, and then enforcement. The Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information, the ONC, is within the Department of Health and Human Services. ONC is responsible for coordinating the national efforts to implement and use health information technology. It also promotes the exchange of electronic health information. And again, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, formerly known as ONC, has been renamed to the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy and the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, the ASTP/ONC. However, when this change, like many changes that just came out of Washington this year, came out, the slides were already in place. So please bear in mind when the slides or the lecture refer to ONC, we're actually looking at the ASTP/ONC. So in terms of applicability, HIPAA applies to covered entities only, and certain things are covered entities. This includes healthcare providers that conduct financial or administrative transactions electronically. This also refers to health plans and healthcare clearinghouses. All of these are considered covered entities under HIPAA, meaning they have to abide by the privacy rule. It also applies to what we call business associates. Not everybody who works for a healthcare organization is a healthcare association employee. So they're considered business associates, meaning that they have certain obligations that they have to follow when they're engaged in doing work on behalf of a covered entity that involves use or disclosure of protected health information, or PHI. And that means that we need to have agreements signed by both parties. The content must be complete, and there are penalties for the business associates and any subcontractors that the business associate is using, and they usually parallel those for the covered entity. HIPAA applies to all workforce members, and that includes employees, volunteers, student trainees, contingent workers, employees of vendors, or anybody, whether they're working routinely on site or working remotely. Are contractors working in a covered entity considered workforce members or business associates? It does matter a little bit whether they're considered workforce members, but in terms of the HIPAA privacy rule, both are covered. And usually the penalties for noncompliance with the privacy rule are very, very similar for the most part. And HIPAA applies to all protected health information, whether it is transmitted in paper, electronic, or oral forms. And this relates to any information that is individually identifiable. And anything is included. This is somebody's past, present, future, physical, mental health, how the mental health is provided, and payment. Individually identifiable health information of deceased people is no longer considered PHI after the individual has been deceased for more than 50 years. In other words, it's no longer legally protected. Some of these things include name, address, zip code. In other words, think about anything that is individually identifiable to a patient that helps map their health condition to that individual. If it does that, it can usually be considered PHI. HIPAA does not identify or does not apply to de-identified information. So if information doesn't identify the individual, if we've redacted the name, social security number, medical record number, address, name, date of birth, all these different types of things, and it's just in a data set that addresses the physical condition, it is not applicable. HIPAA does not apply. And there are 18 elements that must be removed to de-identify an individual. So when we talk about the HIPAA privacy rule, we need to get into what are we talking about? And when we refer to the individual, we're talking about the person who's the subject of the PHI. The personal representative is anybody who has legal authority to sign on their behalf. And the designated record set it includes not just information from electronic or paper health records, but also billing records, claims records, any administrative records that are used to make decisions about an individual. And even if it's not part of the electronic health record per se, again, if it falls under that, just because it's a billing record, it is considered a designated record set, and the HIPAA privacy rule does in fact apply. With the HIPAA privacy rule, if we need to disclose, use, or comply with a legal request for information, we only release the minimum necessary. So in other words, some of you may recall the Octomom case where a woman had, I believe it was 8 children, and her case was considered very, very newsworthy and everything else. This happened at a Kaiser facility in Southern California. Several people were disciplined and fired for accessing their information because they violated the minimum necessary. In other words, if you don't have a business need to access information, you are in violation if you just go on a fishing hunt to look at somebody's PHI. Treatment, payment, and operations are usually considered exempt, right? So in other words, if somebody's seen in the emergency room and they call over to a physician's office to get information, it's being used for treatment. That is generally considered an exception to the HIPAA privacy rule. There are additional rights under the HIPAA privacy rule. This includes the right of access. In other words, if I want to review my electronic health records from the organization taking care of me, I have the right to do so. I have the right to request an amendment if they got something wrong. I have the right to an accounting of disclosures. So what that means is with disclosure accounting, I can request who has viewed my electronic information. I have the right to request restrictions. I have the right to request confidential communications, and I have the right to lodge a complaint about violations of the privacy rule. And when we say access, we're talking about timely access. So if I want to review records under HIPAA, I have 30 days to comply with this type of request, right? 30 days and only 30 days nationwide. Individual states may have more restrictive laws and require access sooner, but HIPAA privacy rule says 30 days. And again, we must produce the records in a format requested if readily producible. That means if somebody has records that are electronic and I would like them in a PDF or a paper format, I have the right to request that. Again, it's not, everything is not free. If you want to have charges under the HIPAA privacy rule for making paper copies, you may do so. They must be reasonable. They don't necessarily say what reasonable may or may not do for all different types of formats, but it has to be reasonable. It can include supplies and labor, and it can include postage if you wish the information to be mailed to you, right? And again, other states may have more restrictive laws capping what these charges may be. Information blocking, which is under the 21st Century Cures Act, it's in a separate law, but it relates to giving individuals access to their health information. Information blocking is prohibited. So when we talk about information blocking, we're talking about conduct that's likely to interfere with access, exchange, or use of electronic health information. This rule removes any barriers that impede the sharing and exchange of patient information. And this applies to what we call actors, healthcare providers, health information technology developers of certified health IT, health information exchanges, and health information networks. There are 8 exceptions to the information blocking prohibition. These involve not filling requests to access, exchange, or use EHI, meaning electronic health information. And the last slide we have, health TI developers must publish URLs or internet addresses of certified application programming interfaces, APIs, to enable efficient and secure data storage. The Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource, or FHIR, is required to prescribe data formats. This is all relatively new stuff. So again, keep your eye on the acronym FHIR, FHIR, for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource. You'll be hearing more about it in your career in health information management. And that's all I have for you for this video lecture. Come back for the next video lecture where we'll learn more about data versus security and other related topics. So long.